So he would talk about prisoners who were convinced that they were going to be released by Christmas, or convinced that the war was going to be over or whatever. And then when the Christmas came and went and they weren't released, they suddenly died, right? Because they'd given all that hope to that release date. And they or they had a dream and they were going to be free of this camp by Christmas or something. And then it would come true because they would be free of the camp and they would die, is what he would say. It was finding meaning in the suffering in the moment, and also finding purpose in that moment.
Welcome to the Mindful Paths podcast with Nick Day and Hari Kalymnios, where we explore the fascinating world of mindset, mindfulness, fitness, well-being, vitality, leadership, and of course, personal development.
Our goal is to provide you with insights to help you live a more fulfilling, happier, and healthier life.
So if you're striving to be a better parent, friend, leader, colleague, or boss, or if you simply want to be more mindful and aware of the world around you, then this Mindful Paths podcast is going to be for you.
We invite you to eavesdrop on our conversations, and we challenge you to discover a new insight to help you on your own journey towards personal growth and positive change.
So sit back,
relax, and let's begin our journey together
on the Mindful Paths podcast. Hari, good to see you. I've come armed today with a particular book that you recommended, and a guest who listened has sent me a very kind copy. Yeah, and I've now read it. It's earmarked, which probably for those that love a book will hate to see. It's covered in earmarks and highlighters and pens and quotes and everything else. But today, I should probably give some context. I'm going to ask how you are in a moment. But today, we're going to be talking about the Victor Frankl book, Man's Search for Meaning, the classic tribute to hope from the Holocaust. Over 16 million copies sold. And it links to a lot of the stuff we talk about in terms of mindful paths and what meaning. And as you often say, nothing means anything apart from the meaning you give it. So we're going to jump into that today. But before we do, how you been?
Yeah, I've been good, actually. The last couple of days, although I'll tell you what's weird. I think the last 3 weeks, I think I've had some sort of weird virus of some sort that I'm not aware of. I'm not aware of it as I go about my day-to-day, but my ring scores for today is the first time in 3 weeks that I've got over 80 in my readiness score, my aura. The others have been really low, and my HRV is low and my heart rate is high. And this is without, it's like sometimes finishing dinner at 3 PM, which normally would bring it down to the low 40s, and it's in the 50s. So I think I've had some sort of weird virus last couple of days, because last few weeks.
You weren't feeling that great last time we spoke to you. It's of course a seasonal change. I know that something that's impacted me, and my scores have been low as well. But I've suddenly had a really, those that know me will laugh when I say this, because I'll say I had it before this, but a really low tolerance to alcohol recently. Like I had 2 glasses of wine and felt like I was off my trolley the other day. And a couple yesterday, and woke up this morning with what felt like a raging hangover from 2 glasses of wine. So that's having an impact on me that's slightly different. Well, I've also made an intolerance to white fish from absolutely nowhere as well. So it's middle age.
I mean, that's it. My gut is normally really amazing, and then recently it's felt like just inflamed for some reason. So I think I've had some weird stomach bug. But today was the first day, and scores were 88, and I felt good, and I think I was in bed by 10:30 last night, which is always good. So I think whatever's happened is on the mend. But also, and it might play into what we're going to talk about today, because I think I had a few things on my mind. And I think last week I had half term, and I had this, so I wasn't doing anything in the schools, and I had this week where I thought, right, I'm going to make some traction with some of the projects that I really want to get done. And I felt like the week just didn't happen for me in the way that I wanted. And I was thinking about this, and it ties into what we're talking about with Man's Search for Meaning, because I felt like last week I didn't have a purpose. Like I had the purpose in terms of, I've got these projects I want to do, but they're me putting my own deadline on. But when you're working for other people, you've got other responsibilities. They tend to say, like, if you want something done, give it to a busy person, right? Because you tend to be just way more efficient. And when you've got all the space, I was finding it harder to wake up. I was finding it, I was thinking, well, I've got this week, I need to recover. And also my scores were off. So I was like, okay, let me just focus on the recovery. But then I wasn't sure if my scores were off just because there's some underlying stress about not getting some of these things sorted. And I was thinking about this as when you said last week, let's talk about Man's Search for Meaning, which, as we'll talk about in a second, it is about purpose, is about having kind of some sort of future vision. And I was thinking, I wonder if it's because there was like not a purpose to the week. And I find that a little bit with my dad, right? So he's now retired 15 years. But he doesn't get up to like 11, 12 now, and he's always asleep. He hasn't got a purpose, right? To be frank, like obviously, yeah, he's got his is it 5 nieces now, 5 grandchildren, and everything. But you know, his 2 sisters died last year. The husband of one of the sisters died last week or 2 weeks ago. The funeral was then. You know, he celebrated his 80th earlier a couple of months ago, but this whole idea of purpose, I think it's so important. So I think it's really appropriate that we talk about this meaning.
Agree. And actually, I'm going to link into that then with a quote which I'll mention in just a minute to kick off what this book is all about. But before I do, so I've had 5 hours in the car today, got up first thing this morning, rushed back to see my dad in Salisbury. He's been feeling pretty, obviously, for those that listen regularly will know he's fighting terminal cancer and hasn't been feeling so great. And I wanted to get down and see him, pick him up a bit, give him a bit of a bit of a boost, a moral boost, and let him know we're thinking of him and supporting him. And then back in the car, I was only there for 3 hours. He lives 2 and a bit hours away, got back here and then straight into work. But it's interesting. So the book, I'll link the two in a moment, but and your story as well, with a fantastic quote that I just think really sits well with what you've just mentioned. The book itself, for those that have no understanding or reference to what it's about beyond the title, is Victor Frankl was a Holocaust survivor who, for all intents and purposes, lost everything. I think most people would suggest, including his family, and in Holocaust and in the concentration camps, and he survived it. And it's very much about his survival and how he found meaning in the survival. But then, and I think the other thing to mention here is it's not a feel-good book. There's a lot of self-help books out there that are. That's not what this book's about. It definitely dives into the darker side of life and darker side of what humans can do to other humans and of humanity and of the things that we have to do. But there's light in the book, and that links to what you've just mentioned with your dad, and actually with my dad as well. And that the quote I was going to mention here is Frankl says in the book, "So to live is to suffer, to survive is to find meaning in the suffering." Mm-hmm. And you and I talk a lot about meaning and the idea that, and this is what the book's about, Man's Search for Meaning, the idea that no one can take away everything from us, no matter what the situation is, not what the external circumstances are. The one thing that I think the book is trying to say is we always have the choice to choose how we feel in that moment. We have the choice to provide meaning to any circumstance, any situation, and no one can change that for us. And you might think, well, you know, what meaning can I be give if you're going to be going in front of a firing squad, or something really, really bad happens? Well, that's still your choice. Whether you're giving your life up for a greater good could be the meaning that you find, but the meaning you give it changes the way that we feel about that situation. And it links to things that we've talked about in every single episode so far, how thoughts impact the way that we feel, that we shouldn't be quick to judge because we don't know what that other individuals are going through, that just because we think something and feel something doesn't make it right, because if we change the way we reframe that thought, we can feel completely different in a moment. And there's loads to take away from this book. There's loads to take away from it.
And it's talking about that reframing that you just, because I read this book maybe 12 years ago. I think I've read it once since then. And then I started listening to the audio version a couple of days ago. I haven't got all the way through it again, but I remember one of the bits, he was talking to someone in the cab, and he was another prisoner who had lost his wife or something, and I think he lost his wife, right? His wife had died, and he was having all this heartache and stuff. And he was saying, it should have been me to go first, and she could have lived and stuff. And then I think Victor Frankl was saying, well, you're suffering a lot right now, right? I'm suffering loads, but by her going, if you'd gone first, then she would have been the one with all this suffering. So
feeling what you're feeling now. Absolutely,
you're not now kind of saving her from that feeling. And it's about that reframe. And I mean, the whole premise of the book really is that, with that suffering, if there's a meaning to that suffering, if there's a meaning to that. And now I was thinking about this the other day, because when it comes to Buddhism, we talk about how suffering is maybe optional. And actually, like pain is a given, but suffering is optional. And I think they're kind of sort of saying the same thing. It's really like, if you decide that there's, reason behind the pain or the situation you're going through, and there's a purpose to it or a greater good or whatever, then you can bear that. And I think he says, he quotes Nietzsche or something where he says a person who has enough why can bear anyhow or something like that.
Tolerate anyhow. That's right.
Yeah. And so I think we talk about reframing a lot. We talk about nothing has any meaning except the meaning we give it. And I do feel like that gets lost on people, where it's like linguistic gymnastics. And
it's a concept though, isn't it? It's something that it's not just a quote. It's something you have to let in, you have to let it embed, and you have to let it awaken the senses inside. It's a really powerful concept. There's going to be a few quotes I was going to mention today, which I've highlighted from going back through my notes, because obviously it's relevant. We're talking about the book. But Frankl says the last human freedom is the ability to choose one's attitude in a given set of circumstances. And that's it. That's the freedom that we do have internal. And I think the idea being that no matter what happens to you, no matter what you're going through, and people will be listening to this going through all kinds of small T trauma, big T trauma, incidents, times, life is a challenge. It's what makes life exciting, right? If everything was always good, we wouldn't understand what good looks like, because we've never experienced the bad. You need the yin and need the yang. But no matter what happens to you, you can always choose your attitude towards it. You can choose your meaning of what that means. You can choose your response to it. And I know you've talked a couple of times about the road rage incident you had, and your response could have been two different things. And we think that's all the time. How often we respond too quickly. I could have responded differently on reflection. But you can always control your response to what happens and how you feel about how you responded. And that's something you always have control of.
Well, you think you do, but most people, I think is it in Victor Frankl's book as well? It talks about stimulus and response. I think it's
yes, he does.
Yeah, so stimulus and response. That between the stimulus and the response, there's a gap, and it's in that gap that we have the ability to make that choice. Now, the challenge is that most people, the stimulus and the response happens immediately. In that, you hit your foot against the table. Actually, this happened to me yesterday. It wasn't I hit my foot. I was at my friend's house, and he's got one of these, these cookers, not cookers, cooker. It's instant hot water.
Okay, right. No.
You can turn the tap, and you get instant.
Yeah.
And I hadn't used this thing for a while, so I was doing it and trying to fill up my cup, and then basically, long story short, I managed to burn my hand, right? Burn my finger. Now, my instinct is normally to go, scream out. But as I know, and because I've trained with this, I notice the pain, but then I, take a step back and I kind of breathe through it, or I kind of do it a bit more rationally. Now, most people, that stimulus and that response happens straight away, right? If someone spills a hot coffee on you, you've got to do something, right? Whereas when you train yourself, and we've talked about this before, I think with meditation, mindfulness, things like that, you can notice there's a gap, even though it's only a fraction of a second. And as you train yourself with more meditation techniques and so on, you can lengthen that gap so that you can respond rather than react in a moment. And I think that's a really...
I don't disagree with anything you've said, but I think the importance for me, from what I take away from the book, is it doesn't matter if you react instantly, and it's not necessarily the reaction that you're proud of. We can do things and we can end up feeling like we're totally fucked, totally stuffed, right? We're totally powerless. And often we can become apathetic at that point. What's the point anyway? Nothing we can do. This has happened to me. Oh, poor me. We become victim, the victim mentality. And that's natural, by the way. I'm not saying anyone shouldn't feel that way or anything like that, but it's a natural response. But it's often on the awareness of that response, the reflection of that response, that you realize that not everything we first thought is true. It's true because that's how we were thinking about it in that moment. But actually, we always have the power to choose how we respond to what's happening to us. And I can continue to think in an apathetic mood that I'm totally fucked, or I have the power to change that meaning at any point. I think that's the bit that's important. A bit like the example you gave with the wife, and the really powerful example in the book with the wife who dies, and the guy can't deal with the suffering. It doesn't take away his instant response of suffering, but he was able to reframe that suffering later when he was able to change the way that he interpreted this, what it was all, the meaning of that suffering.
And you're coming to it from a certain cognitive awareness, right? Like where you say, we have the power to choose that, and we do, right?
Yeah.
My experience with most people is then they're not aware of that, right? And so that they don't feel like they've got a choice in how they respond.
Sure. No, I accept that. That's what we're hoping to do today, though, right? Is bring some of his workings to. The reason I highlight that, I'm sorry, I will let you go back. I just want to try and get the distinction is not everyone's going to be able to extend that gap, though, from listening to this podcast without a lot of work. And I don't want people to come away thinking that it's the instant response that's important. For me, it's the cognitive response and choice that is the real value in this book.
Response, afterwards.
Yeah.
Because at the end of the day, and I have I don't know whether it was with you years ago we had this conversation or not. I think it was slightly different, actually, the conversation we were having. It was, which we won't get into. I think it was about one of your friends who you were hoping to change things. But I was saying, we can't make anyone feel a certain way. So like when someone says, oh, that Nick, he made me so mad. Nick didn't make you mad.
No.
Nick did something. You chose to respond, and your body chose to respond in a certain way to generate madness within you. And therefore you're putting the blame, you're putting the responsibility onto Nick to actually influence how you feel. And of course, other people's actions do influence how we feel, but we're the one generating those feelings. And it's a really hard thing for when I have this discussion with certain family members. And I guess I can be a bit pedantic with it if they say, you make me like this. I'm like, I don't make you anything. Like, you're creating you. Obviously, that's not always the right moment to be coming up with these ideas and these theories for them. But it's really interesting.
There's a child-based. So I've used this with my kids, and I may have mentioned it on the show before. I think everyone knows I love my parables, right? And this links to a parable about a great swordsman. It's quite a long story, so I'll cut straight to the punchline of the story, essentially. But if we picture this now of a group of bullies in the school playground, and I'm obviously butchering a parable and trying to make it current, okay? So bear with me. I don't know. Let's say there's 3 bullies in this particular example. There's the bully who's insulting a child and says they are this, that, and the other, right? You'll have one person that maybe the bully's friend that laughs at that thing. That's their interpretation of the words being said. There's the person that receives the feedback who is being bullied, who maybe feels terrible by those words, and maybe the bully as well who feels something else. So that there's the words are the same for 3, but they're directed at different individuals, and the feelings that they impart on those individuals change. But and obviously that all depends on how you receive that information. So as you were saying, they can't make them feel anything. It's how they interpret it. Now this links to a parable about a great swordsman who used to win loads of battles. So he had a battle with a Zen master. The way he used to win the battles was he would, and I think I've said it on the show before, one of the earlier episodes, he would insult them until he found a weakness. And they would eventually, they would get so insulted, they'd react. The masters would lose their calm, and then he would find their Achilles heel and kill them because he'd managed to rile them so much. But the idea of the story when you're dealing with bullies, and to put it in the context of children in the playground, and I said this to my kids, if a bully says something to you, if a bully wants to give you a gift and you choose not to receive it, who does that gift belong to? Well, it belongs to the bully because I haven't accepted it. In the same context, if a bully gives you an insult and you choose not to accept it, who does that insult belong to? And it belongs with the bully. So I'm using that as an example because, as you've mentioned, in simple terms, if I say you are X, Y, and Z, I can choose to accept that and feel bad for it because I'm interpreting it that way, and therefore I must be because they said it. And these are all things internally. In the same instance, I could just decide not to accept that insult. And I can have the interpretation that it's therefore lives with the bully, whether it does or not, that's up to the bully to receive it. But it's a totally different feeling. And yet the words haven't changed. It's the way that we receive that information and how we choose to feel about it in that moment. But I highlight that because for those that listen to this who've got kids, I think it's a really powerful way to deal with a bullying comment because they can understand it.
Not even just useful for kids. I'm finding now I've actually been off things like Twitter for or X or whatever we're supposed to call it now for about 3 months or so, which is great. And but I am still acutely aware of I guess the word I hate actually is triggering, right? There's this word triggering, right? People get triggered by certain things.
Yeah.
I often have to tread carefully with, the students that I do speeches with, because, we have 30 different people, they're 30 different speeches. I kind of know what the speech is going to be about if I have time to go around to all 30 students beforehand, so we can kind of think about how we frame it, because there's been a lot, for example, it's not so much this year. Last year, there was a lot of, I guess, tiptoeing around the Andrew Tate topic. I don't know if it's
okay.
That's familiar to you. It might not be a name that's familiar to you, Andrew.
Yeah, no, Andrew Tate. Yeah, there's a documentary on it recently on.
Okay, yeah, and so I mean, I'm quite versed in it. Like I've not just watched the highlights. I've watched maybe like 10 hours of interviews across different platforms and that, because I feel like when I come into that conversation, especially with the boys, that it's useful to have all that background. But I know some of the female trainers, they feel quite intimidated, especially when sometimes the boys tend to do this symbol, which is like the fingers and the triangle type thing. And again, nothing means anything except for the meaning you give it. So if the female trainers are taking, oh, these guys are all misogynistic, blah, 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 right? They're going to feel threatened. But I don't want to use Andrew Tate as an example, but I'm just saying that there are conversations, and specifically right now, we're having kind of a tiptoey time around the whole Israel-Palestine issue, because we get a lot.
Sure.
We don't get a lot, but I get a couple of speeches about that every now and then. And it's interesting because there's certain words, and I've been looking, there were some certain words being chanted at protests, pro-Palestine protests, and I heard an Israeli minister talking about how these words should be outlawed, and they are meaning that we are trying to call for the destruction of Israel. That's her meaning of that. I'm not in that camp, so I have no definition for those mm-hmm. words or the other. But it's about how you tread that line is quite interesting, because I feel like that line is becoming narrower and narrower, and it's easier and easier to fall foul of it, because people say, well, that's triggering me, or that's offending me, or and it's like, well, where does the personal responsibility lie for that person to say, in a way, just
we live in a blame culture though now.
Yeah, exactly. And you're always going to offend someone. Mm-hmm. I mean, obviously you want to, and I always say, you've got to speak about things in a way that you try and involve the whole audience so they don't alienate people. But at the end of the day, there's always going to be like 20% of people that are going to love you no matter what you do, 20% that hate you no matter what you do.
Sure.
And you're going to fight for the rest in the middle. So I guess it's that I feel like we're living in a bit more of a culture where there is that blame, there is that victimhood, there is that
victim mentality.
Yeah,
it is there. But if we change that meaning, it can be really powerful. I mean, something that comes into the book, and something that you are a massive advocate for, and rightly so. I'm certainly becoming more and more of one the more I follow the path of a very simple path of being grateful, right? And I go back to the Simon On quote: "It's impossible to be grateful and unhappy at the same time." But you can take it further. And I think Victor Frankl does that in the book to link it back. He's like, no matter what you go for, the meaning is, where can you find an area that you can be grateful for within the suffering? So, if you link it back to you doing for some people, public speaking in front of a big group of people would be terrifying. Yeah. And they would be suffering, and they would be feeling anxious, and feeling all of these things, frustration that they've been asked maybe. But just by putting the words, I'm grateful, before whatever that is you're feeling, can change the whole context of the situation. So it could be, I'm grateful for the frustration that I feel about doing this, because it's going to allow me to grow, because it's going to force me to do something I'm really uncomfortable doing. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be pushed in a direction I don't like to be pushed. And there's obviously a million different examples.
Yeah, I got some specific feedback yesterday along those lines. So they have a free-form section at the end of the feedback that they can write what the most impactful workshop was. And a few of them, because I talk a lot about pushing yourself out of comfort zone, first attempt in learning, FAIL, fail, all these sorts of things. And they were like, I'm grateful, like I was pushed out my comfort zone, it helped me grow, or something like that, So,
exactly. But if you'd asked them pre-session, how are you going to feel? We are going to push out your comfort zone. They may feel anxious. They may feel frustrated. They may feel worried. And in reality, we can feel those things, but just by adding the two words, I'm grateful, and thinking about why we're grateful for this. And I guess suffering is the word that's used a lot in the book for obvious reasons. He has to find meaning in his suffering every single day. And it's really important. I stress that what he's been through is something that I'm sure none of our listeners, if any, will ever experience that kind of, hopefully no one ever will experience again, right? It's something that goes way beyond something my own even comprehension, really. He lost absolutely everything. And yet he was able to find meaning in that suffering. And if he can do it in those situations, then we can do it if we bring it back to our context and what we're dealing with at the moment, which is only true for us in that moment. There should be a way we can reframe it as well.
Something else that struck me when I was re-listening to the book the other day, and it brings it back to an episode. I can't remember whether it was 3, 4, somewhere along there, but it was the time when you were talking about the Tottenham fan, the famous Tottenham fan, the hope that kills us. He says it's the hope.
Yeah. That was a while ago now. Yeah. Lee McQueen.
Yeah, that's it. So
on the Last Word on Spurs podcast.
That's it. Yeah. So what was interesting was, so he would talk about prisoners who were convinced that they were going to be released by Christmas, or convinced that the war was going to be over, or whatever. And then when the Christmas came and went, and they weren't released, they suddenly died, right? Because they'd given all that hope to that release date, and they or they had a dream and they were going to be free of this camp by Christmas or something, and then it would come true because they would be free of the camp and they would die, is what he would say. But it was like, because you have so much hope, and I was thinking about this from a reverse angle, and I years ago, this is like now 15, must have been more than that, 18 years ago, I was in Devon, so not that far from where you are. My mate Ben's, who lives up in Bideford, and we were going, I think it was around New Year, actually. I was staying with him for New Year's because they had this big party down in Bideford in New Year's usually, and we were going for a run. This was back when I was running. And I was thinking about this the other day because I've just tried to start running again very, very gradually to do one of these high rocks events we were talking about the other day. But anyway, so we were going for a run, and he was training for a marathon. So this must have been before I did my marathon. So this must have been around 2005 because he was doing the Boston Marathon. So he was already quite a runner and I wasn't. And we were running along the beach, and I was saying to him, his dad was going to come pick us up from somewhere. And he was like, he's going to come and pick us up, but it's not for like we've still got another 6 miles or something like that. And because I knew that I had 6 miles, suddenly my hope had gone, because I was like, I've got so much further to go. And actually he was doing a mind game with me, because his dad was only like maybe 400 meters away, and he went off and started running off, whereas I had slowed down. And it was the reverse of that hope. It was that like there was no finish line.
But it's what they do in SAS training, right? You go and do and you don't know where the vans are going to be. You think they're there and they're not. And they go, do it again, until eventually you go, I've had enough. And what you don't realize is around the corner the vans were there, and you lost selection at that point. I don't know if you read. I know you've read the first book. I can't remember what it's called now. The David Goggins books. I haven't quite finished the second book, but the second I've read the first. Never Give Up, is it? Never Hurt. Can't Hurt Me. That's right. And the second one's called something else, but I'm reading it at the minute. But the second book opens with a hope experiment where there's rats that are put into a pool of water, and it's seeing how long they swim until they give up. And I think the average time in the book, it opens with this. It's in the first chapter. And it talks about, I think the average time was like, I don't know, let's say for argument's sake, it's not in front of me, an hour and a half, 2 hours. It was roughly around that number. And then they would give up and they would drown. Then they did the same experiment again. But as they're about to give up, that time frame they tend to give up, someone would come in and rescue them and then put them back in the water and rescue them again each time. They revisited the rats like 2 weeks later or whatever it was in the study. And bear in mind, I'm probably butchering this study, but you'll get the premise. But by the end of it, when they tried it again, after the rats knew they had hope that they would be saved, they were able to get the rats to swim for like 40 hours. And so they were able to do that the first time. It's just the hope made them give up and they drowned. And they took that option when they realized there was a chance of being saved, which is similar to the as you say, the soldiers, similar to how we feel when we're tired. I mean, it links to physiological things as well, that we run better when we're happy. If we're feeling about sad, there's loads of experiments about we are stronger when we have happy thoughts and weaker when we have negative ones. We are more powerful as athletes when we're feeling positive than when we feel negative. And yet, actually, with the same body, our mind is so powerful that just what we're, smiling and running will make you more efficient and less tired than if you're miserable and running, which is madness, but it's true.
Because your muscles will be less tense, and therefore you're gonna not seize up, and you're gonna have more freedom to have a better conversion of your energy, right? Because you're not gonna have to overcome all that.
But it links to strength as well. There are strength tests. There's an actual test you could do, I think, where you hold someone's hand down and ask them to think of happy thoughts, and then you do the same thing again on a negative situation. They haven't got the same level of strength, or the other way around.
Oh, it's really kind of like applied kinesiology. I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Actually, that's another book that I want to talk about at one point. I need to reread it, and I would love you to read it, but it's called Power versus Force, but we'll leave that for another time. But I wanted to talk about something that you just mentioned there, where I guess with the book, The Man's Search for Meaning, that there's a couple of things that I was thinking. So yes, there's that hope. And so some of the people who survived the camp, they were having the visions of the brighter days that were going to come after the war and everything else. But also, I think, it was finding meaning in the suffering in the moment, and also finding purpose in that moment. So always being like clean shaven, and I mean, they were talking about, being clean shaven, making your cheeks a bit redder so you looked healthier and stuff, but like having like a purpose within the camp, or having something, responsibilities within the camp, or to do something, because otherwise they were just the walking dead basically, and then they were more likely to die. And so
it was like any kind of slight win, because the whole ambition for a certain degree was to dehumanize them. Anything they could do that rehumanized them, whether it was in secret or not, gave them that power that they hadn't won their minds yet.
The war is going to end. You don't, because that's the hardest thing, is that because you can effectively overcome most things when you feel like, and I say this too shall pass, right? Nothing lasts forever. So you're in a comfortable environment, it's not going to last forever, right? Let's say you're sitting in between two people on a plane who are massively overweight, and you're hunched in. Yes, it's really annoying and uncomfortable, but it's not going to be for more than, say, a few hours or something, as opposed to a lifetime. But there, they didn't necessarily know, I guess, when it was going to end. So therefore, they had to find those bits of hope, or those bits of purpose within the process that they were doing, which again, I think is something to do with, to me, when it comes to goals. I know this isn't about goals, but I've kind of gone towards the idea of a process-driven goal rather than an outcome-driven goal in my thinking. So an outcome-driven goal being, complete that marathon. The process-driven goal being, being able to wake up and go for that run each day, and having those benchmarks along the way, and having those not just milestones, but being passionate about the process rather than the finish line. Because
that's the same as I'm a big fan of impossible goals, but you have to have those. You've got to have no attachment to them, because they're, in theory, they're impossible, but it allows you to think differently. It changes the way that you do things, the way that you
Buddhism is also about, right? This idea of non-attachment, right? So, and I've been trying to come up with a metaphor that works for people to understand this idea of non-attachment, and the best I've come up with so far is having a balloon, holding onto a balloon. Is that, the balloon bit is the goal, I guess. It's there, but it's you're not so attached to it. It's like waving around a little bit. It's going to change around. I haven't come up with the perfect metaphor for describing this idea of non-attachment, because on the one hand, you're sort of attached, but on the other hand,
I use it in a different context. I use it with one of my colleagues at work this week, literally, and it was like, look, I want you to, the number you need to hit roughly is X. So we're going to times that by 10. I'm going to handcuff you I'm going to imagine I've handcuffed you to the table right now. And if you don't get this number that I've asked you to hit in the next 12 months, you're never going to see your family again. All these, your worst things would come true. What are the immediate things you would do to reach that, what is an impossible target by anyone's standards? And the individual came up with like 25 ideas that he'd never come up with before. Now, it doesn't need an attachment to the goal, and he knew there was no attachment to it, but it immediately encouraged him to think, not straight away actually, but immediately when he got into what it was all about, to think differently, think outside the box. And interestingly, and as I think Simon Sinek talks a lot about, you can achieve And it's not about the how, it's about the who. I think it's Simon Sinek who talks about, bringing people in. The how will take care of itself, but who can help you achieve it? Suddenly, this individual in my business was talking about, well, I could rope in the marketing manager could do this, and the ops director could do this for me, and I could reach out to this. And I was like, all brilliant ideas. So why aren't we doing these things now? What's stopping you then from doing these things? And sometimes it's permissions. There's a whole host of different things. It's a really good exercise where in that instance, though, he knew from the outset, there was no official attachment to that goal, but he was able to change the way he thought in a safe environment to think bigger.
Zig Ziglar, the late great motivational speaker, I mean, he talks about, I think it's him or it's Brian Tracy, but it's not about the goal. It's about who you have to become to achieve that goal, to even be on that goal. And I say that when I used to run these goal setting sessions, and I think I may even have it. I've got a chapter on goal setting in my book, and actually one of the steps is like an 11-step process, but one of the steps is about, who do you need to connect with?
100%. Because the first question often when we get stuck in the how is, I don't know how to do this. Well, who's the first person you would call when you have that thought? Oh, I'm going to phone my dad. I'm going to phone my friend. And great. You're already on a starting point now to achieving the how. And we probably need another session or a podcast. But it sounds
my friend, who wants to start the podcast, she's like, I guess, who do I call? Oh, Harry. All right. So then I was like, okay.
There you go. You're going to phone a friend.
And I put her in touch with you, and you spoke to her about the podcast, right?
Yeah. And now she's she's getting it. That's it. Don't get so stuck in the procrastination side of it's all too much for me. But so I want to talk about in the book, which I thought was interesting. Is he doesn't talk about it, but my interpretation of it. So man's search for meaning arguably is all about, and he talks about his therapy. I should mention he comes up with a method called logotherapy, which
it's a Greek word.
Yeah,
means. So again, it's a Greek word.
Is it? Oh yeah, I should know.
Yeah, logos means meaning.
Okay.
Reason.
So man's search for meaning, also effectively relating that to what is the meaning of life. And my interpretation is there isn't necessarily a meaning. There is no exact meaning you'll get. And I say that because he likens it really cleverly. Something I wish I'd come up with myself, but it's his, where he likens it to a chess champion being asked, what's the best move in the world? And of course, it depends on the specific situation. And Victor Frankl says, hence, man should not ask what the meaning of life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked, he who is responsible for giving it meaning. It's in his hands. I thought that was really powerful. And linking to that led me down a path of talking about the way that we label things. So the first thing someone might think when they read this book is, concentration camp is really, really bad. And I don't deny that to be true. And that's obviously a massive, huge thing that most people would agree with. But in day-to-day life, we label things all the time as either bad, good, frustrating, sad. And I had this conversation on the back of reading this book, which I should add as well, was sent to me by Emma Wynn, one of our listeners, who was very, very kindly posted to me after you mentioned it in one of the earlier episodes. So thank you, Emma. Big shout out for you for sending it through, because I've loved this book and it's inspired this entire episode. But I had a conversation with my daughter about a label that she had given. It was earlier this week. I won't say what the label is because it was a confidential conversation. But the idea being, I'll change the label and use the word bad. I said, just imagine if instead of we now say bad, if that label was suddenly cool, that in your school, every single person in your class suddenly wanted to feel bad. Like that was suddenly the coolest thing in the world to feel bad. It's what everyone wants. When you feel bad, you might feel terrible, it might be hurting, you might feel like you've got COVID or flu, but you almost want it because to everyone else, it's now been labeled as it's cool to feel bad. The whole feeling then we have, the meaning of it to us is completely changed. Because although you feel like crap, because the way that we're interpreting it now as it's cool to feel that way, it almost isn't bad anymore. And I don't know if that's the best example I've given. It was better in the word the thing that she was feeling. But often we have these labels, and when we attach ourselves, and it was maybe think about it when you talk about attachment to goals, when we attach ourselves to a label, we automatically allow ourselves to follow the feeling that we've attached to that label. I feel frustrated, therefore I am automatically this. What if feeling frustrated actually was always a route to growth? If I told you every time you felt frustrated, you would always 100% of the time grow from that experience, again, our interpretation, our meaning of the word frustration would change.
Absolutely, right? I think it's Tony Robbins that often talks about frustration and confusion precedes kind of clarity or kind of light bulb moment, right?
Yeah, right.
if you know that, then it's great. I mean, like one of the things that I remember hearing about when I was listening to sales training, and I think I've mentioned this before, but you're selling widgets for $1,000, right? And you have to knock on 100 doors before you make a sale. Every person that turns you down is, giving you £10 effectively, because you have to go to 100 people, each get £1,000 at the end of it. And so you'll have a different association to that rejection, as it were. It's not a rejection, it's just one more out of the way to get you one step closer to where you need to go. This is what I say to the children, and I keep saying it on every podcast, right? Nothing has any meaning except the meaning you give it, just like the meaning of life. I mean, I think I've discovered the meaning of life for me, but again, that can also change. And this, I think, what Victor Frankl talks about in his book is that, the purpose of your life is not static, right? Like at some point, the purpose of your life might be to help that person survive the day in the concentration camp.
Without going too wayward, I'd say the meaning of life is there is no meaning, arguably, right? Because it can change daily based on whatever you're experiencing in that moment.
For me, the meaning of life for me is to A, experience it, and then B, to love and serve others. They're the two meanings I have, right? One is just to experience it, and the other is to love and serve others. Now, that may change. That will be different for different people. Some part of me, though, the bit that wants to know, right? I want to know the secrets of the universe. That's why I did physics and astrophysics, right? And it always all these alien stuff. And
you love a rabbit hole. You love a rabbit hole.
I love a rabbit hole because I want to understand, and also like that's what maybe why I might be attracted to plant medicines or meditation or things like that, because I want to know what it is. And every time I do a what is, I realize it's whatever you want it to be.
But so this links to a quote in the book, which I labeled. I love this, and I've put this into my coaching notes because I think it's really simple. And you may have heard it, which one it is. It's that when it can't be changed, we are challenged to change ourselves. The idea being, as my interpretation of it being, that when we can't change an external situation, there's nothing that we can do about the externals. Actually, we're offered the opportunity to grow beyond ourselves, because we can change our response to those external situations by changing our internal interpretation of it, our internal meaning of it. It's so powerful, and we can often think we're hopeless. Frankl talks about suicide in the book, which again, for those that may have had suicidal thoughts or tendencies or whatever, he says something to think about is, if you're in that moment, consider who else relies on you and what else needs to be achieved first. Because there's always something that comes. It links to the impossibility of replacing someone, number one, but also it links to the suicidal mindset that we are unique. There's something that distinguishes us beyond everybody else. What is it we need to achieve first in order to give meaning to our existence? And it allows us to create that meaning that we're looking for. The man's search for meaning. If we have meaning, we don't have those thoughts, but we've got to try and recalibrate and reconnect with what that meaning is.
This is what I was talking to you about on the text the other day, which I don't think you started watching yet, but you're familiar with the blue zones, Dan Buettner's work.
Yes.
So for those listening that maybe are not familiar, the blue zones are certain regions of the planet where there are higher numbers of percentages of people who live to over 100. And there are a few like Ikigai in Greece, Sardinia in Italy, Loma Linda, California, Okinawa, Japan, and a couple other places. And but in Japan, they have this, and they have something similar. I think it was in Costa Rica, but in Japan, they have this principle, which I think you've probably heard of, Ikigai. Have you heard of it?
Yeah, I have Ikigai.
So Ikigai is, I guess, for those listening who aren't familiar, it's the intersection between things that you're good at, things that you can get paid for, things that the world needs, and things that you enjoy. So, you enjoy, you're good at them, you can get paid for them, and the world needs. And that almost becomes like, so it's kind of like purpose, but it's a bit more than purpose. But it is that reason being, and it's a big thing, I think, in certain areas of Japan anyway, this idea of Ikigai. And I think it is this idea of purpose and having a reason. Like a lot of these, like Warren Buffett springs to mind. He's like 96 years old, still going strong. yeah, you could say he has lots of great, amazing medical treatments, which I'm sure he does. But I think he's just truly passionate and purposeful about what he is doing. And this is why purpose forms a part of the BEAT model under activity. PSPC is passion, service, purpose, and connection. And so when you've got a purpose, you can have the energy of a 5-year-old. You can get up early and go to bed late. And this is why I think it's a lot of people are post-retirement within a few years may pass it on because they don't have that purpose, or
that goes back to the quote you said at the start of the show by Nietzsche, which is he who has a why to live by can bear with almost any how. It's really powerful.
I wanted to jump in when you were talking about Victor Frankl, and if you can't change it, you change yourself, sort of thing. If you can't change things.
When it can't be changed, we are challenged to change ourselves. When it can't be changed, that's the external. Where we have to look internal. Well, that's how I interpret it anyway.
This is what I was saying to the students the other day. I was saying, because we can only control our attitude and actions, we can't control anything else. Like, so for example, if you're running late to work, what can I do? And I think I used this example before. It's like, you phone ahead, you try a different route and everything. And once you can't change those external circumstances, you have to change, how you feel about it. And I think Victor Frankl talks about it in his book, or maybe not in the book, but the copy I've got, I think I should lend you, because there's about an hour of a prefix of his book, because he originally meant to publish this essay.
That's right.
Anonymous.
He does talk about that in the book I've got. So
maybe it's an exact same version of that. But I think he takes some of his principles, from Stoic philosophy, because that idea of concentrate on what you can control, cope with what you can't.
Yeah,
it's very important. Or control what you can control, cope with what you can't, concentrate on important is a fundamental Stoic philosophy. And these things like Buddhism, Stoicism, Logotherapy, they all intermix and all intertwine, and meditation and mindfulness.
Of course it is. They always says there's nothing new in this world, right?
Many years ago, I wanted to write this book about talking about the intersection between spirituality and science, because I felt that as science gets more and more progressive, they start to discover more and more what mystics and yogis have been talking about for thousands of years. And then I worked out, I think it might be up there on the Tao of Physics by a guy called Fritjof Capra or something. And it was written in the 1970s, but he talks about string theory, like superstring theory, which is physics theory, and mindfulness and meditation. And so he actually wrote that book already. But I was because when I started discovering all this stuff, because my background, obviously physics, astrophysics, science, but also lots of yoga, meditation, I was like, there's so many overlap in here. A lot of people think that science can't sit with religion or spirituality, but I don't think that's true at all. And as you discover things, you're like, oh yeah, so the observer impacts the experiment, right? And they talk about, there is this all connected idea, and we talk about that as quantum entanglement in physics, but actually they call that yoga, unity, union. That's what the whole thing means, is this connectiveness, or the force in Star Wars, right? Whatever you want to call it. But yeah, he wrote this book, and I was like, but it's a hard book to read, but it is a good book.
There you go. Maybe your version is a simpler version.
Simpler, yeah.
and we'll link it to Frankl then, because your experience in terms of what you studied, what you researched, will still be incredibly different, even though the premise of linking the two is the same. Will be very different to his. And linking it back to Man's Search for Meaning, Frankl talks about how no matter what we've experienced, what I've experienced, what you've experienced, and obviously they're worldly different in the way that brought us here today. No one in the world has the power to take that from us. Doesn't matter who you are. And I think it was you that gave, this isn't a Frankl quote, but in a previous episode, and I wrote it down, and I've got it on my notes here. I think it was you, because that's why I wrote it down. You said, when you doubt your power, you give power to your doubt. And that kind of links to that as well. So don't lose the idea that whenever we've experienced, no one in the world can take that from us. And if you start to doubt it, that's where the problems can start to arise. So that's the links back to the awareness piece of just being aware of how we're feeling in that moment, and what, can we change the meaning of it? If we are suffering, if we're really struggling, I struggles in my life right now. There'll be struggles in lots of the listeners' lives right now, whether it's my dad, or whether it's work stresses, or other things that we're going through in our lives, right? It's, if we're able to give meaning to it and understand that there's meaning to the suffering, and then that, it just makes everything a little bit easier.
Even if you can't give meaning to it, like some interesting questions might be to ask yourself things like, what's great about this? What's I don't know, how can I get through this, right? What are the steps I need to do to take myself through? It's about asking those questions. It's like Google.
It is. I mean, you gave me those questions to give to my dad, right? Which we did.
Oh, yeah.
50 questions. And that was a while ago. I mean, I'm grateful I had the opportunity to go and see him today because his first diagnosis gave him 3 months. And that was over 2 years ago. So you're grateful for every single moment that he's going through that suffering because he's still here, right?
I really want you to watch that Live to 100 one, but I think it was in episode 5 or 6, and he talks about this guy, so a Greek guy, grew up on Ikigai, which is one of the blue zones, but he left when he was 20 or something to go to America, follow the American dream, buy a car, all of this, and he worked there. He was 65, 66 years old, and he went to all these specialists because he wasn't feeling well, and he went to all these different doctors that all gave him the same prognosis. I think he had, was it lung cancer or something? He had some sort of cancer, was given 6 months to live. So he said, right, you know what? I don't want to die in America. I want to go back to Ikigai and be buried there. And so he goes back to Ikigai to be buried, and he plants this vine leaf or vineyard and stuff. And he said, oh, my wife will be able to see it grow. And then the Dan Buettner goes and interviews him now at 103 years old. Right, he is outlived. Like, all these doctors said he would have 6 months, and now 35 years later, or whatever it is,
amazing.
He was 103 in this interview.
I bet he's grateful for every day.
So yeah, what do doctors know, right? My brother-in-law's mum was given 6 months a couple of years ago as well, and she's still around, and she's just met her new granddaughter.
Well, a lot of it's about hope. I'll put it out there. My dad's got his 50th wedding anniversary to look forward to in January. So he ain't going before then in my book. He's got loads of things to look forward to. He's got a project going on in France. There's loads of things. It's about having that hope. We talked about the rats earlier, right? You can stop swimming or keep going. And let's keep going. Loads of excitement, loads of experiences, loads of meaning still to be discovered. And I think that's exciting. There's a great story with that. Yeah, I like that. There's a book called Cured, which I've sent to my mum. You might know it as well, about loads of life stories about people that have beaten their diagnosis and defied science, essentially, with the prognosis.
Well, I don't know if it's defying science or just defying one or two doctors' opinions.
Quite possibly. I think I've told you my grandma's story, right? I'll probably will finish with this. This is a absolutely true story, and probably a good way to close the show. Talking about our search for meaning, we have our meaning dictated to us by experts. Often they use the word doctors a moment ago, and of course they're very skilled at what they do. The reality is we don't know everything in this world, and we're constantly defying science and logic every single day. So my grandma, who sadly is no longer with us, but years ago was diagnosed with a terminal brain tumor. And my dad and her other children took her on holiday. I think it was to Greece, actually, funny enough. I think it was maybe it was Cyprus they went to, something like that. Anyway, she was a religious woman, which for her, this gave her a lot of meaning, and whether you are or not doesn't really matter. But when she was out there with a brain tumor that was due to terminally take her life, with all the doctors' views, she was violently sick. And she said the sick she had was completely black in color. Nothing she'd ever seen before. She was really ill, and they took her back early. I think they took her back early because she was so sick and so ill. But when she went back for her scans, the brain tumor had completely gone. No trace of it. She lived another 25 years after this brain tumor. And she believes that, spiritually, that was God's way of, getting rid of whatever it was in her mind. But she was sick. And whether there's any connection between the sick and the tumor, I don't know. The color, I don't know. No, who knows? But she defied science. There was literally no trace of it back on the scans when she went back, and she lived on with it with no brain tumor.
I'm not surprised, but it's always nice to hear kind of second hand.
Yeah. That's my grandma. So sadly, she's not with us anymore. But it gives me little chills down my spine when I hear things like that with someone you actually know. It's frightening.
Yeah, that is great. That's
a good way.
Cool. All right, well, that's probably a good place to leave it then. And
well, I recommend the book. Look, and for those who aren't readers, this is not a big book. I mean, it's literally the story. Get the audio version. The story itself actually is only 100 pages. The last, how many pages are now? 50 58 pages are all about logotherapy. It's called Logotherapy in a nutshell, which talks about the meaning of life and the man's search for meaning post. But the actual story of what he went through and the hardship is 100 pages. You can read it in a few hours. So if you haven't read it, 16 million copies sold for a reason. Thank you, Emma, for sending me my copy. Thank you, Hari, for introducing the book to me in the first place on this first episode of this show that we ever recorded. Fantastic book, and will live with me. The learnings from it will live with me forever, I think. So I highly recommend it.
Yeah, me too. Cool. All right. Well, it's nice to chat. I hope you have a good rest of your evening and everyone.
You too, buddy. And that's our first book review. Yeah, there we go.
Have we not reviewed any other ones?
I think so. I don't know if that's a full review. We both. I think we're leaving on the idea that we both.
Gadgets. Yeah, we did gadgets. That was it. But yeah, lots of books. But Power versus Force would be a good one to read. That's all about the kinesiology stuff.
All right, send me the link. All right, buddy. Listen, good to see you. I will catch you next week, sir. Take care of yourself.
Bye bye.
Bye, buddy.
Thanks for tuning in to the Mindful Path podcast with Nick Day and Hari Kalymnios.
We hope you found our discussions insightful and hopefully you've gained some valuable takeaways to support you on your own journey.
Please leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform and share an episode that resonates with you with a friend or family member who may also find it valuable.
Please also don't forget to subscribe to our podcast to ensure you never miss a future episode. And in the meantime, we'll continue exploring mindful path topics to provide you with more insights and more ideas to support you on your personal growth journey.
Thank you for your support and look out for the next episode of the Mindful Path podcast dropping soon.